Welcome to Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now you can learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property. Learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau with the Mineola law firm of Shane, Dox, Denisi, and Corker. He's a member of the Committee on Professional Ethics of the Bar Association of Nassau County and counsel to the Nassau Academy of Law. And now, here is your host for Law You Should Know, attorney Kenneth J. Landau.
Hi, this is Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. Today we'll be discussing tax residency and collection issues, and they might involve more people than you think, and we want to tell everyone how to prevent problems in that area. And our guests today are attorneys Karen Tannenbaum and Yvonne Court. Karen is the principal of her own firm in Melville, and they are both past chairs of the Tax Law Committee of the Nassau County Bar Association. Karen, in addition to being a lawyer, is also a CPA and has a master's in tax law. And they both speak at all types of bar associations and business organizations around the state and help their clients to resolve income tax and payment and residency issues. Welcome back to Law You Should Know.
Thanks so much, Ken.
Thank you.
And people may not think about it that often, but every time they realize after it's too late, why would someone not want to be a resident of New York State or New York City, even if they spend some time here and perhaps have a residence here, have a house here?
Well, it's interesting because taxpayers are considered residents. When a taxpayer is considered a resident of New York State, they must pay income tax on all of their income, no matter where it's derived. And if they're a non-resident, they would only pay tax on income that's allocated here. That's New York source income.
So even if they live here less than half the year, they would still have to pay state taxes.
Well, there are two tests. One, if you are domiciled in New York, you pay tax on your income no matter where it's derived. And if you are considered a statutory resident, which means you have a permanent place of abode, which we'll define in a moment, and spend more than 183 days here, then you are taxed as a resident as well.
So if you earn a lot of income from places outside New York, it could be to your advantage to limit your contact with New York State.
It can be very expensive to be taxed as a New York State resident. So many taxpayers find it beneficial to be living out of state and only be taxed on their New York source income. For example, if you have income from investment income, for example, not related to New York State real estate, you might be able to avoid New York State tax on that if you're living out of state.
Would it also apply to someone who his employer might be outside New York State? Would they be able to claim they do part of the work for that employer outside the state, as opposed to traveling to an office in Manhattan or Mineola every day?
Well, there are rules that discuss allocation and where your income is derived. But I also wanted to mention that New York City rules are similar to the state rules. So although we're going to generally discuss, let's say, New York, Florida, it also would apply to someone who has a house, let's say, in New Jersey, is clearly domiciled in New Jersey and Connecticut, and maybe comes to the city to work in the city and has an apartment there as well.
And if someone lives on Long Island, could they have some issues with whether they live or work in New York City? Let's say they have an apartment in the city or a place of business in the city.
Sure.
Absolutely. Someone who lives on Long Island and has an apartment in the city may be subject to that additional New York City tax if they're found to be a resident of New York City.
And again, it would be on all their income, not just the New York
Exactly.
City generated income.
Right, and what happens often is, maybe you get an apartment for your college-age child, and they're living in that apartment, and you don't even realize that you've now signed a lease or bought a place and subjected yourself to this type of audit, perhaps.
Okay. And the first step is sort of some type of self-disclosure, what status a person gives themselves?
Well, the forms actually require you to check off a box if you maintain a living quarters in the state or in the city. So you have to check the box, and then you have to say how many days you spend in the city.
If you feel that you're a New York State resident or you have New York source income, you would be obligated to file a New York State tax return to cover that.
But you're better off if you do that and spend less than half your time in the city or state.
So again, one of the more recent cases involved someone who lived in Connecticut, worked in New York City, but had a vacation home in the Hamptons. And he didn't even realize that just having a place in the state and working in the city subjected him now to tax in the state. And he ended up with over $1 million tax liability. And because he didn't check the box, he ended up with penalties.
And
the question comes down to, one, where is your true home? That's your domicile. And for that, they look at 5 factors because it's really a subjective test, but you need to have objective factors. And then the other piece is, once you meet that burden of proof which the taxpayer has by clear and convincing evidence, you then have to go to the second test, which is, are you a statutory resident? Do you have a place in the state or in the city that is deemed a permanent place of abode, and then a day count? Do you spend more than 183 days?
okay, and let's just take what those 5 factors are.
Okay, do you want to?
Yes, of course. So the 5 factors that New York State looks at is, where is the person's home? Where do they comparing the actual building, which is bigger, which is more expensive, which one has been recently renovated, how much do you use it? And it's really all a comparison between the place in New York and the place that the taxpayer might claim to be their domicile. And the next one is their business activities. How much time do they really spend? How involved are they in their business in New York or in their other location? And then also how much time, the physical time that they spend in New York or their other location. And again, you're comparing the two. So this is different from that 183-day rule. So you may have a taxpayer who says they live in Florida and they move from New York to Florida, but they're spending a lot of time traveling. So if you look at how many days they are actually in New York compared to Florida, they may physically be spending more time out of New York, but more time in New York State than they actually spend in Florida. Another factor is, where do they keep the things that matter to them, the things they find important, whether it's sentimental, like their favorite recipes or their photo album, their wedding album, or it could be their more expensive artwork. And also their family connections. Are they close to their family? And especially where their minor children go to school can be a major element in determining where they really live.
So you may want to try to move them out to New Jersey.
Well, let me just tell you the statistics here. Last year, New York State raised over $200 million alone on this residency program. And it involves, as I mentioned, a lot of New York, Florida, and a lot of out-of-state people.
And in general, to avoid the problems of being a New York City or state resident, people almost have to keep a record or log of where they spend, let's say, each night or each day.
Well, the taxpayer has the burden of proof by clear and convincing evidence, especially on the day count, where they are every single day of the year. So an unknown could be held against them.
And sometimes people come to us and they say, well, how did they know where I was? Let them show that I wasn't really at home. And no, the answer is, once New York State challenges you, once New York State starts an audit, it's up to the taxpayer to prove where they were. And you have situations where the taxpayer says, well, I was just at home in my hot tub. I was just at home relaxing with my kids, and you don't have any proof.
So you might want to try to get proof that you were somewhere else, and you might want to avoid proof that puts you in certain geographic locations.
Well, at a minimum, you want to keep some kind of diary if you think this is going to be an issue. And one of the more recent cases, a very famous case, Robertson, the gentleman would have owed $26 million in tax alone, $47 million with interest, and he agreed that he was here exactly 183 days, but no more. And he said to his secretary, you keep track of where I am every single day. And because he was so credible, when he flew in at 1:45, he said, that's a day in New York. I'm giving you that New York City day. He ended up winning and didn't know the money.
And, of course, he might want to land in Jersey at 1:45, not cross the state line for a few minutes or hours.
Well, there is a travel exception, but only if you're just passing through.
So, for example, someone in Connecticut flying out to Europe, they go to Kennedy Airport and fly out from there. That does not count as a day in New York because they're just passing through the airport and New York City on their way out.
But if you did business in Manhattan, you came in the night before, that might count as 2 days.
Absolutely.
2 days, exactly. And a lot of people don't realize it. They come one night and they sleep over and they wake up the next morning. It's 2 days.
Yes,
and if you spent both nights in Newark, you might be able to get around that?
Certainly. I mean, many people who have an apartment in the city, we see this frequently, that they find it a convenient a convenient idea to stay over in the city before they catch their plane out. And if they just took that extra little bit of time to drive to the airport in the morning straight from their home on Long Island or in Connecticut or New Jersey, they would avoid another day in New York.
Now, there's another issue. You don't have to actually spend time at your permanent place of abode for it to be counted as a day against you.
It's being within the city limits.
It's right. It's two separate tests. Where are you for 183 or more days?
That's how the guy in Connecticut, he didn't use his vacation home very much, but he worked in the city. So he physically had over 183 days in New York State, even though he wasn't actually at his house in the Hamptons.
And we know this challenge can be a situation that, let's say, rich people might have to deal with, but not so rich people may have to deal with it too. If they have a residence in Florida or a vacation home somewhere else, or second home somewhere else.
Right. You see it with a lot of people who are downsizing. You know, they do keep the place in New York because maybe they bought it at a reasonable price and it's cheap. It's a cheaper alternative than a hotel. And now they're moving to a smaller place in Florida where they're going to golf or they're going to be gardening in their backyard. And they're probably not keeping a calendar of where they are and what they're doing. And it's a hard burden.
So this can apply to your typical snowbird as well.
This is exactly what that is, yes.
And it could be pension issues too, and I guess bankruptcy, which bankruptcy, if you, other laws might apply. There could be pension issues too, taxable or whatever, depending on where you are.
Well, I think there are exemptions relating to the pension.
Okay. But if you had investment income and things along that line, if you're a New York resident,
well, that's exactly the point. You're going to be taxed on your capital gains, your dividends, your interest, which are intangibles. If you're taxed in New York, you're going to be taxed on it, on all of it.
Regardless of the source. Right. Okay. I just want to move on after our break to the collection issues. Anything else either you'd like to say about the residency issue? Well,
there are new guidelines because the state realized that there were some issues relating to this and the more recent cases, and the state came out with new guidelines which are available on their website.
Okay, and I know that both you help people avoid these problems and resolve these problems if they occur. We're going to take a short break now. We're discussing tax, residency, and collection issues. We'll focus on collection issues, how to work them out and avoid those problems. After the break, our guests are Karen Tannenbaum and Yvonne Court. They're both with the law office of Karen J. Tannenbaum in Melville, Long Island, New York. You are listening to Law You Should Know here on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College in Garden City, Long Island, New York, and also over the internet at ncc.edu/WHPC. We'll be back in a moment.